A simple
Let
black
go of
coffee
me! I
and a
didn't do
slice of
anything!
cherry
Sir,
pie.
calm down.
That was all
You're coming
State
with
Senator
us.
Julian
This is a
Thorne
mistake.
wanted
Get your
on a
hands off.
quiet morning.
Let's go. Move
Yet
it.
to Officer
You can't
Garrett
do
Blake,
this!
the black man in a tailored charcoal suit seated in Oakmont's most exclusive diner, was no customer. He was a target. Before long, body cameras would capture a gross abuse of power. A pair of steel handcuffs clicking shut, and a single devastating phone call from the governor's mansion that would end a career forever. Listen closely, because the justice served is absolute. Oakmont County was the kind of affluent, insulated suburb where the tree canopies perfectly shaded the meticulously paved streets, and the neighborhood watch treated an unfamiliar license plate like a 5-alarm fire. It sat just 40 miles outside the state capital, a haven for old money and quiet politics. Senator Julian Thorne, 52 years old with silver dusting his temples and a mind sharp enough to cut glass, did not live in Oakmont. He represented the 12th District, a bustling, diverse metropolitan sector that Oakmont's residents only visited when they had tickets to the theater. Julian was a former civil rights attorney who had climbed the grueling ladder of state politics through sheer grit, unmatched intellect, and an unshakable moral compass. He was currently chairing the state's most powerful judiciary committee. He had left his home before dawn to drive to a private breakfast meeting with a key swing vote representative at an Oakmont country club. The meeting had ended early, leaving Julian with an hour to spare before he needed to be back at the Capitol building for a grueling legislative session. He pulled his black Mercedes S-Class into the lot of the Oakmont Diner, a local institution famous for its stained glass windows, leather booths, and blueberry pancakes. Julian stepped out of the car. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked inside. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, innocent sound that momentarily paused the low hum of conversation. The diner was sparsely populated, a few retirees reading the morning paper, a couple of construction foremen getting a heavy breakfast. Julian took a seat in a corner booth, placing his briefcase gently on the vinyl seat next to him. Clara, a 20-something waitress with a tired smile, walked over with a menu. "Morning, sir. Coffee to start." "Black, please, Clara, and a slice of the cherry pie if it's not too early for dessert," Julian said, his voice a rich, resonant baritone. He possessed an inherent dignity, an aura of authority that commanded respect without ever demanding it. "Never too early for pie, honey. Coming right up." Clara smiled, genuinely warmed by his polite demeanor. Julian opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of briefing papers regarding an upcoming police reform bill, and clicked his gold fountain pen. For a short while, the world was peaceful. The smell of roasted coffee beans and sizzling bacon filled the air. Then the bell above the door chimed again. Officer Garrett Blake walked in. Blake was 45, carrying an extra 20 pounds around his midsection under his tactical vest, and possessed a jaw perpetually set in a resentful scowl. He was a 15-year veteran of the Oakmont Police Department, a big fish in a small manicured pond. Blake was infamous in the department for his proactive policing. He saw himself as the gatekeeper of Oakmont, the sheepdog protecting the flock from the wolves. But Blake's definition of a wolf was heavily skewed by a deep-seated toxic prejudice. He had an extensive file of civilian complaints, mostly for harassment and excessive force. But the local police union and a sympathetic former chief had always managed to quietly bury them. Blake walked in out of the crisp morning air, slapping his leather gloves against his palm. He exchanged a nod with the diner manager, Vincent, who was wiping down the counter. "Morning, Garrett. The usual?" Vincent asked. "Yeah, Vincent. Black coffee to go." Blake leaned against the counter, his eyes lazily scanning the room. It was a habit, sizing up the environment. His eyes swept past the retirees, past the construction workers, and then his gaze locked onto the corner booth. Blake stopped chewing his gum. His eyes narrowed, tracing the lines of the black man in the expensive suit reading documents. He looked out the large front window, spotting the gleaming late-model Mercedes parked directly in front of the diner. Out of county plates. In Blake's mind, a narrative instantly fabricated itself. Nobody around here dresses like that on a weekday morning unless they're going to court. Cars probably leased, or worse. Doesn't belong here. The toxic cocktail of arrogance and bias began to simmer in his chest. He didn't see a public servant preparing for a legislative session. He saw an anomaly that needed to be checked, pushed, and reminded of where he was. Clara walked past Blake carrying Julian's coffee and a plate of cherry pie. "Who's the guy in the corner?" Blake muttered to Clara as she passed. Clara stopped, looking confused. "Him. Just a customer. Ordered pie and coffee. Very polite." "Yeah, well, I haven't seen him around here," Blake grunted, pushing off the counter. He didn't wait for his coffee. He adjusted his utility belt, making sure his radio and sidearm were sitting just right, and began the long, slow walk across the black and white checkered floor toward the corner booth. From his peripheral vision, Julian saw the uniform approaching. A lifetime in America, coupled with decades as a civil rights lawyer, had honed his situational awareness to a razor's edge. He knew the walk. He knew the posture. It was the aggressive saunter of a man looking for a reason to exercise power. Julian didn't look up. He took a slow sip of his coffee, turned a page of his briefing, and waited for the shadow to fall over his table. The heavy thud of standard-issue police boots stopped right at the edge of the booth. Blake stood uncomfortably close, his hand resting casually but purposefully on his belt, right next to his taser. "Morning," Blake said. The word was a greeting, but the tone was an interrogation. Julian calmly finished the sentence he was reading, capped his fountain pen, and finally looked up. He met Blake's hard stare with eyes that were perfectly calm, yet completely unyielding. "Good morning, officer," Julian replied smoothly. Blake chewed his gum, looking Julian up and down, then glancing out the window at the Mercedes. "Nice car out there, yours." "It is," Julian answered neutrally. He didn't ask how he could help. He didn't offer a nervous smile. He simply answered the question and waited. This lack of subservience instantly irritated Blake. He was used to civilians stammering, over-explaining, or immediately shrinking in his presence. "What brings you to Oakmont?" Blake asked, leaning forward slightly, invading Julian's personal space. "Breakfast," Julian said, gesturing to the half-eaten cherry pie. "Don't get smart with me, buddy. I asked you a question. You don't look like you're from around here." "I wasn't aware that Oakmont required a local residency to patronize its diners, officer." Julian trailed off, letting his eyes drop to the nameplate on the uniform. "Officer Blake." Blake's face flushed. The quiet, commanding intelligence in Julian's voice felt like an insult to the cop. "We've had some burglaries in the area lately. High-end neighborhoods, lots of suspicious activity. I'm just doing a routine check. I'm going to need to see some ID." The diner, previously filled with the soft clatter of silverware and quiet chatter, suddenly went dead silent. The retirees at the next table lowered their newspapers. Clara, the waitress, stopped filling a sugar dispenser at the counter, her eyes wide. Everyone was watching. Julian did not reach for his wallet. He sat perfectly still. He knew the law in this state better than the man who wrote the police manual. He had literally co-authored the state's revised code on search and seizure. "Officer Blake," Julian said, his voice remaining level, not raising a single decibel. "Unless I am mistaken, this state does not have a stop and identify statute that compels a citizen to present identification simply upon request. Furthermore, under Terry v. Ohio, you are required to have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime in order to detain me. Does eating cherry pie while black constitute a reasonable suspicion in Oakmont?" The words hit Blake like a physical blow. Nobody talked to him like this, ever. Especially not the people he usually targeted. The mention of case law, the utter lack of fear, and the direct calling out of his racial profiling sent Blake into a blind, ego-driven rage. "Listen to me, you arrogant piece of work!" Blake hissed, dropping all pretense of a friendly check. He slammed his palm flat onto the table, making Julian's coffee cup rattle. "I don't give a damn about your locker room law degree. I told you we have burglaries. You're driving a $100,000 car. You're out of place and you're refusing a lawful order from a police officer. Now give me your ID or things are going to get very ugly, very fast." Vincent, the diner manager, hurried out from behind the counter, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. "Hey, Garrett, come on. He's just having breakfast. He paid already. Let's not cause a scene." "Back off, Vincent. This is police business," Blake barked, not breaking eye contact with Julian. Vincent recoiled, holding his hands up and stepping back, powerless against the badge. Julian slowly uncrossed his legs and planted his feet firmly on the ground. He looked at the officer's chest. "Is your body camera activated, Officer Blake?" Blake sneered. "Yeah, it's on. It's going to catch you resisting." "Excellent," Julian said. "Then let the record show that I am sitting in a public accommodation, minding my own business. I have broken no laws. I am not acting suspiciously. You have articulated zero legal justification for demanding my identification. Therefore, I am refusing your unlawful request. Am I free to go, or are you detaining me?" It was a masterclass in legal verbal judo, and Blake had just been pinned. But a man fueled by absolute power and bruised pride rarely thinks clearly. Blake saw red. He felt the eyes of the entire diner on him. If he backed down now, he looked weak. He looked like he had been bested by the exact type of man he despised. "Oh, you're not going anywhere," Blake growled, stepping back and unsnapping the retention strap on his holster. It was a subtle intimidation tactic, but a deadly one. "You are officially detained for interfering with the police investigation and obstruction. Stand up." Julian looked at the unsnapped holster. He recognized the lethal danger of the situation. He was a senator, yes, but right now, in this diner, he was just a black man facing down an angry, armed police officer. He knew that any sudden movement, any perceived aggression, could end his life. "I will stand," Julian said slowly, raising his hands so they were clearly visible. "I am complying with your physical orders under duress, but I am stating clearly for your camera that this is an unlawful detention." "Stand the hell up and turn around. Hands behind your back," Blake shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Julian slid out of the booth. He stood up to his full 6'2" height, towering over the stocky officer. The physical disparity only angered Blake more. "Turn around," Blake yelled, grabbing Julian roughly by the shoulder and spinning him around toward the table. The physical contact crossed a massive legal and moral threshold. Blake roughly shoved Julian's chest against the edge of the table, knocking over the coffee cup. The dark liquid spilled across the white saucer and soaked into the briefing papers, the very papers detailing the police reform bill Julian was championing. "Put your hands behind your back now," Blake commanded, pressing his forearm aggressively into Julian's spine. Julian offered zero physical resistance. He calmly placed his hands behind his back, interlacing his fingers. "I am not resisting, Officer Blake. I am fully compliant." Blake unhooked his handcuffs from his belt. The sound was distinct and chilling in the quiet diner. Zip, zip, click, click. The heavy cold steel snapped tightly around Julian's wrists. Blake squeezed the metal cuffs down an extra notch, purposefully making them bite painfully into Julian's skin. Julian winced slightly but did not make a sound. "You have the right to remain silent," Blake began, panting slightly as he recited the Miranda warning, yanking Julian backward by the chain of the cuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The patrons in the diner were in shock. A teenage boy in a booth near the window had his smartphone out, recording the entire interaction. Clara was covering her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. It was a grotesque display of raw, unjustified humiliation. "Let's go," Blake snarled, grabbing Julian by the bicep and marching him toward the diner entrance. "Officer," Julian said calmly as they walked, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the room. "You are making a monumental mistake, one that will irrevocably alter the course of your life." "Save it for the judge, pal," Blake laughed mockingly. "I've heard it all before. Every perp thinks they're untouchable." Blake shoved the diner door open, pushing Julian out into the cool morning air. The sun had fully risen now, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the scene in the parking lot. Blake marched Julian toward his cruiser, pressing him hard against the side of the vehicle and aggressively patting him down, spreading Julian's legs with a harsh kick to his ankles. At that moment, a second Oakmont police cruiser whipped into the parking lot, lights flashing, and screeched to a halt. Blake had hit his radio panic button during the argument in the diner. Out stepped Officer Elias Quinn. Quinn was 24, a rookie fresh out of the academy, and unlike Blake, he still possessed a conscience. He jogged over, his hand resting on his duty belt. "Garrett, what's going on?" "You hit the button," Quinn said, assessing the scene. He looked at the impeccably dressed, handcuffed man pressed against the squad car and then at the pristine S-Class nearby. Something immediately felt wrong to the young officer. "Got a non-compliant suspect here, Quinn," Blake said proudly, out of breath. refused to ID, matched the profile for the burglaries, resisted detainment. Obstruction. I'm taking him in. Quinn looked at Julian. Julian turned his head, resting his cheek against the cold metal of the police car, and looked directly into the rookie's eyes. "Officer," Julian said to Quinn. His voice was no longer just polite. It was the booming, commanding voice of a state senator who commanded rooms of hundreds of people. "My name is Julian Thorne. Your senior officer has unlawfully assaulted and arrested me without cause. Since he is intent on booking me, I suggest you retrieve my identification. It is in the inside left breast pocket of my suit jacket." Blake laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, now he wants to show ID. Too late for that, buddy. You'll be identified at the station when we run your prints." Quinn, however, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The man didn't sound like a burglar. He sounded like a judge. "Garrett," Quinn said hesitantly, "let me just check his pocket. Protocol says we should identify before transport if possible." Blake rolled his eyes. "Fine. Check his fancy suit. Probably got a fake ID in there anyway." Quinn stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," he said respectfully, reaching into the inner pocket of Julian's Brioni jacket. His fingers brushed against a thick premium leather wallet. He pulled it out and flipped it open. There, sitting behind a clear plastic window, was not a standard driver's license. It was a solid gold, beautifully embossed identification card. At the top, in bold, unmistakable lettering, it read State Senate. Below that, a high-quality photograph of the man currently in handcuffs. And below the photo, Senator Julian Thorne, Chair, Judiciary Committee. Quinn stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale white. His hands began to visibly shake. He stared at the card, read the words 3 times, and then slowly raised his eyes to look at the man pressed against the hood of the car. "Garrett," Quinn stammered, his voice cracking completely. "What?" Blake snapped, adjusting his belt. "He got warrants? Tell me he's got warrants." Quinn turned the wallet around, holding it out with trembling fingers so Blake could see the gold shield and the bold letters. "Garrett," Quinn whispered, absolute terror laced in his words. "He's a state senator." Blake froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening slackness. He stared at the gold card. He read the name Thorne, the man who basically controlled the state's law enforcement budget. The man who was leading the police reform task force. The cold morning breeze suddenly felt like ice against Blake's skin. For the first time in 15 years, Officer Garrett Blake realized he had just destroyed his own life. Julian Thorne turned his head, looking at Blake with eyes as cold and deep as the ocean. "Like I said, Officer Blake," Julian spoke softly, "a monumental mistake." The silence in the diner parking lot was absolute, broken only by the low, steady idle of the Oakmont police cruisers. Officer Quinn stood frozen, the gold state senate identification card trembling in his hand. He looked like a man who had just pulled the pin on a grenade and realized his fingers were glued to it. Officer Garrett Blake stared at the embossed gold lettering. The blood pounded in his ears, a deafening rush that drowned out the morning birds. His mind desperately clawed for a lifeline, a loophole, a way to spin this. In 15 years on the force, he had bullied, intimidated, and railroaded dozens of people who lacked the resources to fight back. He relied on the badge to act as an impenetrable shield against consequences. But this wasn't a teenager from the wrong side of the tracks. This was Senator Julian Thorne, the man who sat on the state's Budget Appropriations Committee, the man who could freeze the pension funds of entire municipal departments with a single stroke of his pen. "Garrett," Quinn whispered again, his voice hollow, "take the cuffs off right now. Take them off and apologize." For a fleeting second, self-preservation almost won out. Blake's hand twitched toward his belt to retrieve the handcuff keys. But then the toxic, fragile ego that had driven him his entire life violently reasserted itself. The teenager in the diner window was still filming. The retirees were watching. If he uncuffed Julian now, he was admitting fault on camera. He would be admitting that he had racially profiled, unlawfully detained, and assaulted a sitting state senator. His career would be over anyway. In Blake's twisted logic, the only way out was straight through. I had to stand his ground. He had to make the obstruction charge stick, hoping the police union lawyers could muddy the waters enough to save his pension. "No," Blake said, his voice dropping to a stubborn, defensive growl. He snatched the wallet out of Quinn's hand and shoved it into his own vest pocket. Nobody is above the law, Quinn, not even politicians. He refused a lawful order to identify himself during an active burglary investigation. That's obstruction of justice. He's going to the station. Quinn looked at his senior officer in sheer, unadulterated horror. Are you insane? You had no probable cause. Garrett, this is false arrest. This is a federal civil rights violation. Shut up, rookie, Blake barked, turning his back on Quinn. He grabbed Julian by the arm again, shoving him roughly toward the rear door of the cruiser. Watch your head. Julian did not resist. He ducked his head and slid onto the hard plastic bench of the squad car. He looked up at Blake through the open door. There was no fear in the senator's eyes. There was only a cold, clinical observation. I want you to remember this exact moment, Officer Blake, Julian said evenly, the handcuffs biting painfully into his wrists as he shifted his weight. Your colleague just offered you a chance to mitigate your damages. You chose to double down on a felony civil rights violation under the color of law. You are no longer just losing your badge. You are looking at a federal indictment. Blake slammed the cruiser door shut, cutting off Julian's voice. He stormed around to the driver's side, his breathing heavy, his face flushed a mottled, angry red. He slid behind the wheel and slammed the car into gear. Quinn didn't move toward his own car. He stood in the parking lot, pulling out his personal cell phone. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped it once before dialing the emergency direct line to the precinct's desk sergeant. He knew he had to get ahead of this before Blake dragged the entire department down into the abyss with him. Inside Blake's cruiser, the air was thick and suffocating. The plexiglass partition separated the arrogant officer from his captive, but the tension radiated through the barrier. Blake drove aggressively, taking corners too fast, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was trying to project authority, but the heavy silence from the back seat was tearing his nerves to shreds. Most suspects yelled. They cried, they begged, or they swore. Julian Thorne did none of those things. He sat perfectly upright, his posture impeccable despite his hands being bound behind his back. He was mentally logging every detail, the time of arrest, the car number, the route taken, the speed at which Blake was driving. Julian was building the federal lawsuit in his head, brick by undeniable brick. You think you're pretty smart, don't you? Blake sneered, looking at Julian in the rearview mirror. He couldn't handle the silence. Think that shiny gold card gives you a free pass to disrespect law enforcement. I think, Julian replied calmly, his voice projecting clearly through the partition grate, that the Constitution of the United States applies to everyone, regardless of what neighborhood they are having breakfast in, a concept you seem fundamentally incapable of grasping. We'll see how cocky you are when you're in a holding cell, Blake snapped back, hitting the siren to blow through a red light unnecessarily. Shortly after, the cruiser pulled into the secured rear sally port of the Oakmont Police Department. It was a modest, brick-faced building, usually dealing with noise complaints, minor vandalism, and traffic violations. It was completely unequipped for the political hurricane that was currently sitting in the back of Car 14. Blake got out, opened the rear door, and hauled Julian out by his jacket collar. Move, he ordered. They walked through the heavy steel doors into the booking area. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The room smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. At the raised booking desk sat Sergeant Harlan Briggs, a 30-year veteran who was 3 months away from a quiet retirement. He was drinking coffee and reading a sports magazine. He looked up as the heavy doors clanged shut. "Morning, Garrett. What do we got?" Briggs asked casually, setting his magazine down. He typed his password into the booking computer. "Burglary suspect, obstruction, and resisting," Blake said loudly, marching Julian to the booking counter. Refused to ID, became belligerent. Briggs looked at the man in the handcuffs. He took in the ruined, coffee-stained Italian wool suit, the impeccable grooming, and the calm, authoritative demeanor. Briggs frowned. In his 3 decades on the job, he had developed a sixth sense for when things were wrong. This felt catastrophically wrong. "Name?" Briggs asked, looking at Julian. Before Julian could answer, the rear sallyport doors burst open. Officer Quinn sprinted into the booking room, completely out of breath, his uniform disheveled. Sarge, stop!" Quinn yelled, waving his hands frantically. Briggs stood up, his hand dropping to his radio. "Quinn, what the hell is the matter with you? Catch your breath. Quinn ran up to the desk, ignoring Blake, and looked directly at Briggs. Don't book him, Sarge. Do not put him in the system. What are you talking about? Blake snarled, stepping toward Quinn. I'm the arresting officer. Back off. Quinn turned and pointed a trembling finger at Blake. He unlawfully detained him. No probable cause, Sarge. I was there. I saw the whole thing. And... Quinn swallowed hard, turning to look at Julian. Tell him who you are, sir. Julian stepped forward, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He looked up at Sergeant Briggs. My name is State Senator Julian Thorne, Julian said, his voice echoing in the quiet booking room. I am the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and I have just been abducted by your officer. Briggs stared at Julian. The color instantly drained from the old sergeant's face. He knew that name. Every cop in the state knew that name. Briggs looked at Blake, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and absolute dread. Garrett, tell me you didn't. Blake jutted his chin out. He refused an order, Sarge. I'm doing my job. Briggs slammed his fist onto the booking desk. The loud crack made both officers jump. You stupid, arrogant son of a... Briggs roared. Get the captain down here right now. Captain Raymond Langley was in the middle of his morning briefing in the upstairs precinct offices when his desk phone blared the emergency internal ring. Annoyed, he picked it up. 10 seconds later, the precinct captain was sprinting down the stairwell, nearly tripping over his own boots. Langley burst into the booking room to find a scene of utter paralysis. Senator Julian Thorne was standing silently at the counter. Officer Quinn was leaning against the wall, looking physically ill. Officer Blake was standing rigidly, his arms crossed, desperately trying to project defiance while sweat beaded on his forehead. And Sergeant Briggs was standing behind the desk, holding his head in his hands. Captain Langley stopped dead in his tracks. He had attended a state law enforcement funding gala just months earlier. He had shaken Senator Thorne's hand. He recognized the man instantly. Dear God in heaven, Langley breathed out. He rushed forward, pushing Blake aside so hard, the larger officer stumbled. Langley stopped right in front of Julian. Senator Thorne, Langley said, his voice laced with profound panic. Sir, I am Captain Langley. I cannot begin to express. Captain, Julian interrupted, his voice frigid and exact. Take these handcuffs off me immediately. Keys, give me the damn keys, Langley screamed, turning on Blake. Blake, finally realizing that his Union shield was not going to protect him from the precinct captain, fumbled nervously at his belt. He handed the small silver key to Langley. Langley's hands shook as he reached behind Julian, inserted the key, and unlocked the heavy steel cuffs. Click, click. The cuffs fell away. Julian brought his arms forward slowly. His wrists were bruised and angry red, the metal having dug deeply into his skin. He casually straightened his jacket sleeves, adjusting his cuffs over the abrasions. He did not rub them. He did not show pain. He simply looked at Captain Langley. Senator, please come into my office, Langley pleaded, gesturing toward the secure hallway. Let me get you a fresh coffee. Let's sit down and clear this up. This is a massive misunderstanding. It is not a misunderstanding, Captain Langley. It is a crime, Julian replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. I will not sit in your office. I will stand right here, and I have 3 immediate demands. Anything you need, Senator. Julian pointed a finger at Sergeant Briggs. First, you will immediately sequester Officer Blake's body camera. You will pull the server drive and place it into an evidence bag in my presence. If a single frame of that footage goes missing or is corrupted, I will personally see to it that the FBI tears this precinct apart down to the foundation. Sarge, do it now. Pull the drive, Langley ordered instantly. Briggs began furiously typing at his terminal. Second, Julian continued, turning his gaze to Blake, who was now visibly shrinking against the wall. Officer Blake is to be stripped of his badge, his service weapon, and his police powers immediately, pending a full internal and state-level investigation. You can't do that, Blake shouted, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. Union rules dictate. Shut your mouth, Blake, Langley roared, his face purple with fury. Give me your gun now, and your badge. You're suspended without pay. Effective this exact second. Blake stared at the captain in disbelief. The safety net was gone. Slowly, with shaking hands, he unbuckled his duty belt and handed it over, followed by the gold shield pinned to his chest. He looked small suddenly, stripped of his weapons and his authority. He was just an angry, frightened man who had picked a fight with a titan and lost. And third, Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register, I want my phone. It is in my briefcase, which is currently in the front seat of Officer Blake's cruiser. Quinn, get the senator's briefcase, Langley snapped. Quinn sprinted out the Sallyport door. Within moments, Quinn returned, carrying the expensive leather briefcase. He handed it to Julian as if it were made of glass. Julian placed the briefcase on the booking counter. He clicked the brass locks open, reached inside, and pulled out his smartphone. He ignored the dozen unread messages from his staff, wondering why he wasn't at the Capitol yet. Are you calling your attorney, Senator? Langley asked, nervously wringing his hands. Because we can have the city attorney down here in 10 minutes, too. I am an attorney, Captain, Julian said sharply. I don't need counsel. I need the executive branch. Julian unlocked his phone, bypassed his contacts list, and dialed a private, unlisted number that only a handful of people in the state possessed. He put the phone to his ear. The booking room was dead silent. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to quiet down. Blake watched, his stomach dropping into a bottomless void as he realized exactly who the senator was calling. The phone rang twice, then a crisp, professional voice answered. Executive Office, Chief of Staff speaking. Dominic, Julian said smoothly. It's Julian Thorne. Senator, we were just wondering where you were. The committee session starts soon. The governor is asking for you. I'm going to be slightly delayed, Dominic. Please patch me through to Alistair immediately. There was a brief pause on the line. The chief of staff caught the deadly serious tone in Julian's voice. Putting you through now, Senator. A click. Then the deep, recognizable voice of Governor Alistair Voss came over the line. Julian, good morning. Tell me you've got Representative Cole's vote locked down for the reform bill. Alistair, Julian said, his eyes locking onto Officer Blake, who was now leaning against the wall, looking physically sick. I do have the vote. But we have a more pressing issue regarding the police reform initiative, specifically a demonstration of exactly why we need it. What's going on, Julian? You don't sound like you're at the Capitol. I'm not, Julian replied. I am currently standing in the booking room of the Oakmont Police Department. Not long ago, I was physically assaulted, unlawfully arrested, and handcuffed in a public diner by one of their officers for the crime of drinking coffee while black. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When the governor finally spoke, the easygoing political charm was completely gone, replaced by the chilling, ruthless authority of the state's highest executive. Who is the commanding officer in the room with you right now? The governor asked, his voice like cracking ice. Julian looked at Captain Langley, who was currently sweating through his uniform shirt. Captain Raymond Langley, Julian answered. Put him on speakerphone, the governor commanded. Julian pulled the phone away from his ear, tapped the speaker icon, and set the phone gently on the booking counter. Governor Voss, you are on speakerphone with Captain Langley, Julian announced. Captain Langley leaned over the counter, his voice trembling. Governor Voss, good morning, sir. Captain Langley. The governor's voice echoed loudly through the small, sterile room. Let me be perfectly clear, so there is no ambiguity. You have exactly 5 seconds to explain to me why the chairman of my Judiciary Committee is standing in your booking room with bruised wrists, or I am going to dispatch the State Police Tactical Unit to relieve you of your command and take over your precinct. In the corner of the room, stripped of his badge and his gun, Garrett Blake closed his eyes. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that the world as he knew it had just violently ended. Governor, Captain Langley stammered, the sweat now visibly soaking through the collar of his uniform. It was an isolated incident, an unapproved rogue action by Officer Blake. I have already stripped him of his badge and weapon. He is suspended. Suspended? Governor Alistair Voss's voice echoed from the phone speaker, vibrating with barely contained fury. Captain, you are talking about the chairman of the State Judiciary Committee, the man who is single-handedly rewriting the state's law enforcement code. You don't suspend a man who kidnaps a state senator. You arrest him. I am dispatching State Attorney General Quentin Hale and a unit of the state police to your location right now. Secure the building. Nobody leaves. Not you. Not your desk sergeant, and certainly not the disgraced officer in the corner. Yes, Governor. Understood completely, sir. Langley choked out, his eyes darting around his own booking room as if the walls were closing in on him. Julian. The governor's tone softened slightly, shifting from executive wrath to political alliance. Are you injured? Do you need paramedics? I am bruised, Alistair, but I am fine, Julian replied, picking up his phone and taking it off speaker. I am going to remain here until the Attorney General arrives. I want a full chain of custody established on the body camera footage. Hale is leaving the capital now with an escort. He'll be there shortly. Give them hell, Julian. Always, Julian said, and ended the call. He slipped the phone back into his tailored jacket pocket. The silence that fell over the precinct booking room was absolute and suffocating. Officer Quinn looked like he might vomit. Sergeant Briggs was typing furiously at his terminal, ensuring the server logs for the body camera data were permanently locked down and archived. And then, the heavy security doors from the precinct lobby swung violently open. In walked Wallace Brennan, the regional representative for the Police Benevolent Association. Brennan was a bulldog of a man in a cheap gray suit, known throughout the county for aggressively shielding bad cops from accountability. He had received a frantic text from Blake while Julian was being uncuffed. Brennan stormed into the room, chest puffed out, carrying a faux leather briefcase. He didn't look at Julian. He looked straight at Captain Langley. Captain, Brennan barked, his voice loud and obnoxious. I'm formally invoking my client's garrity rights. Officer Blake is not to be questioned. I hear you've taken his badge without a formal union hearing. That's a direct violation of the collective bargaining agreement, and you know it. We're going to sue this department for breach of contract, and we're walking out of here right now. Brennan turned to Blake, gesturing toward the door. Come on, Garrett. Don't say a word to anyone. We're leaving. Blake didn't move. He stood plastered against the cinder block wall, his eyes wide and hollow. He looked at Brennan, then slowly pointed a trembling finger at the black man standing casually by the booking desk. Brennan finally turned to look at Julian. He looked him up and down, noting the spilled coffee on the expensive suit and the red, raw indentations on his wrists. Brennan sneered, assuming this was just another civilian complaint that he could steamroll. Is this the guy? Brennan asked dismissively. Look, pal, whatever you think happened out there, my officer was acting within his discretionary authority. If you want to file a civilian complaint, there's a form in the lobby, but my client is leaving. Julian slowly closed his briefcase and rested both hands on top of it. He looked at the union rep with a gaze so piercing it made Brennan instinctively take a half step back. Mr. Brennan, isn't it? Julian asked. His voice was a quiet, dangerous rumble. Yeah, Wallace Brennan, PBA representative. And you are? My name is Senator Julian Thorne. I chair the committee that determines whether your union's pension fund receives its state-matched contributions next fiscal year. Brennan's jaw physically dropped. The obnoxious bravado evaporated in a millisecond. His eyes darted to Captain Langley, who gave a grim, slow nod. Oh my God, Brennan whispered, the blood draining from his face. Your client, Julian continued, his voice echoing off the tile walls, is not leaving this building. In fact, the governor of this state has just dispatched the Attorney General and a state police tactical squad to lock down this facility. Your client unlawfully detained me, physically assaulted me, and committed a felony civil rights violation, all while on camera. Julian took a slow step toward Brennan, towering over the union rep. So, Mr. Brennan, you can invoke whatever administrative rights you like, but your client is no longer facing an internal affairs review. He is facing a federal indictment. And if you attempt to obstruct this investigation in any way, I will personally ensure that you are named as a co-conspirator in the DOJ probe. Do we understand each other? Brennan swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. He slowly backed away from Blake. The Union Brotherhood was strong, but Wallace Brennan was not about to go to federal prison for a racist patrolman. I understand, Senator, Brennan mumbled, shrinking back into the corner. He didn't look at Blake again. Soon after, the screech of tires echoed through the precinct's rear lot. Heavy boots pounded up the steps. 4 heavily armed state troopers in full tactical gear entered the booking room, led by a tall, sharp-eyed man in a dark navy suit. It was Quentin Hale, the state attorney general. Hale bypassed the local officers completely and walked straight to Julian, extending his hand. Senator Thorne, I apologize for the delay. The governor briefed me on the way down. Thank you, Quentin, Julian said, shaking his hand firmly. The primary evidence is the body camera footage from Officer Blake. Sergeant Briggs has isolated the drive. Hale nodded, then turned to his troopers. Secure the perimeter. Nobody enters or exits without my direct authorization. He turned his piercing gaze to Captain Langley. Captain, we are taking over. My command center is in your main briefing room. I want the body camera footage queued up on the projector immediately. All officers involved in this arrest will be present. The precinct's upstairs briefing room was designed for morning roll calls, not state-level tribunals. The fluorescent lights were dimmed. At the front of the room, a large projection screen was pulled down. Senator Julian Thorne sat in the front row, his arms crossed. Next to him sat Attorney General Hale. Behind them stood Captain Langley, Officer Quinn, and a thoroughly defeated Wallace Brennan. In the center of the room, seated in a hard plastic chair and flanked by two state troopers, was Garrett Blake. He was shaking. The adrenaline had completely worn off, leaving behind nothing but the cold, nauseating terror of utter ruin. Play the footage, Sergeant, Hale ordered. Sergeant Briggs, sitting at the precinct's media computer, clicked the mouse. The screen flickered to life. It was Blake's perspective, complete with the timestamp in the upper right corner. The audio kicked in, the chime of the diner bell, the low murmur of conversation. They watched as Blake approached the corner booth. They heard his aggressive, unwarranted questioning. Nobody around here dresses like that on a weekday morning unless they're going to court. They watched Julian's calm, legally flawless refusal to provide identification. They saw Blake lose his temper, slamming his hand on the table, the coffee spilling over the legislative documents. "Oh, you're not going anywhere. You are officially detained." The room watched in deafening silence as Blake physically assaulted the senator, shoving him against the table, the sickening click-click of the handcuffs echoing through the speakers. Attorney General Hale's face was a mask of cold fury. He was taking furious notes on a legal pad. The footage showed the march to the police cruiser. It showed Officer Quinn arriving and discovering the gold Senate ID. It showed Blake deliberately ignoring the revelation, choosing instead to double down on his abuse of power. But it was what happened next that turned a terrible situation into a catastrophic one for the Oakmont Police Department. On the screen, Blake slammed the cruiser door shut, trapping Julian in the back. Blake then walked around the front of his car. Officer Quinn was standing there looking panicked. The body camera audio was crisp and unforgiving. "Garrett, this is false arrest. This is a federal civil rights violation," Quinn pleaded on the video. Blake's voice hissed back, laced with arrogant malice. "Shut up, rookie. Just do what we always do. We'll write it up like the Cole kid. Sprinkle a little powder in the floorboards at the impound. Say he matched the description of a fleeing suspect and lock him up. Judges in this county believe anything I write. We own this town." The video paused. The silence in the briefing room was no longer just tense. It was lethal. Julian slowly turned his head to look at Captain Langley. Langley looked like he had been shot in the chest. "Captain," Julian said, his voice deadly quiet. "Who is the Cole kid?" Langley couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating. Attorney General Hale stood up slowly. He looked at Blake, who was now openly weeping, his face buried in his hands. "The Cole kid," Hale said, answering for the captain. "Darius Cole, 18 years old, arrested by Officer Blake months earlier for narcotics possession and resisting arrest. He's currently serving a multi-year sentence in the state penitentiary. He claimed the drugs were planted. The department cleared Blake of any wrongdoing." Julian stood up. He walked over to where Blake was sitting. The two state troopers tensed, but Julian simply looked down at the sobbing man. "You didn't just profile me, Officer Blake," Julian said, his voice echoing with the weight of absolute justice. "You revealed a systemic pattern of corruption, evidence tampering, and perjury. You thought your badge was a shield, but all it did was record your confession." Julian turned to the Attorney General. "Quentin, I don't just want this man arrested. I want the Department of Justice to tear this entire precinct apart. I want every single arrest report Garrett Blake has filed in the last 15 years audited. I want the Darius Cole case reopened by tomorrow morning. And I want the mayor of this city in my office later today." "Consider it done, Senator," Hale said firmly. He gestured to the troopers. "Arrest Mr. Blake. Book him on false imprisonment, assault under the color of law, official misconduct, and conspiracy to commit evidence tampering." The troopers pulled Blake to his feet. The man who had terrorized Oakmont for a decade and a half didn't resist. He was broken. The heavy steel of the trooper's handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The poetic justice of the sound was not lost on anyone in the room. As they marched Blake out of the briefing room, Julian picked up his briefcase. He looked at Officer Quinn, who was still standing by the wall, trembling, but standing tall. "Officer Quinn," Julian said. Quinn snapped to attention. "Yes, sir. You did the right thing today. You tried to stop it. When the state takes over this department, and we will take it over, we will be looking for officers with integrity to rebuild it. Keep your record clean." "I will, Senator. Thank you," Quinn whispered. Julian Thorne walked out of the briefing room, down the stairs and out the front doors of the Oakmont Police Department. The mid-morning sun was shining brightly. His black Mercedes had been driven over from the diner and was waiting for him at the curb, keys in the ignition, courtesy of a terrified desk sergeant. Julian opened his briefcase, pulled out the coffee-stained briefing papers on the police reform bill, and smoothed them out on the roof of his car. He didn't need the papers anymore. He had all the evidence he needed to pass the bill unanimously. He slid into the driver's seat, adjusted his tie, and drove toward the state capitol. Justice had been served in Oakmont. But for Senator Julian Thorne, the real work was just beginning. Absolute power corrupts, but true justice always leaves a paper trail, or in this case, body cam footage. Officer Blake thought his badge made him untouchable, but he picked a fight with the wrong man and lost everything. The system only changes when we drag the truth into the light. If you loved watching arrogance get absolutely dismantled by intellect and authority, hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves seeing karma served hot. And make sure to subscribe for more intense real-life drama stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in the senator's